Thank you, Dennis. So you now have the biography of my life, both the peripatetic version of every place I've lived for the past 10 years and the obscure story of how Dennis and I met. But I should start by saying maybe more conceptually where I'm coming from. As was alluded to, I'm a linguist, and the primary interest that I have, very broadly speaking, is understanding what it is people know when they know a language. Right? So very broadly, that's my undergraduate lecture. It's what do we know when we know a human language? Specifically, what I'm interested in is what we know such that this is cool and appreciable and contentful and meaningful, and it's the red bits in particular that I'm interested in. So what was Lewis Carroll playing with when he constructed his Jabberwocky prose? So what is there's all this nonsense bits and pieces, whiffling and jabberwock and tulge and burble and and so on, but there's all these recognizable bits as well. There's the various bits of function, the very standalone function where the and is in, and then there's these things like ish, and the d and the z and the i's and the ing and the e and this is what makes it English Jabberwocky, right? This is what contrasts with the French translation, which is a translation of nonsense, right? It's a translation because it's making use of the systematicities, these sublexical systematicities of French to create French-like nonsense as opposed to English-like nonsense. So what I'm really interested in is what we know, what information we have about the world, and then critically, of course, from a processing perspective, how we make use of that information. So in this very global sense, what was Lewis Carroll able to do, and what are we able to do to make sense of this and figure out which bits are verbs and which bits are meant to be nouns and so on because of these morphological cues, but then very much more specifically in what will follow, how do we make use of that information in real time, really rapidly, to understand utterances that are coming in. So for a very long time, there's been fairly compelling evidence that we know stuff about morphology. The Lewis Carroll example is a great one, and this is another one. We know stuff about morphology that goes beyond having memorized a stored set of forms and recognizing some patterns. So this is Jean Berco's lovely little experiment. This is a wug. Now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two. Everyone. Wugs. Sorry? Wuggai. Right? Yeah. Luckily, most 3 and 4-year-olds are more cooperative. And we'll generally say there are two wugs. Wug has now kind of actually entered the English lexicon because these are such famous experiments. But at the time that Berco was doing these experiments initially, obviously, wug was a completely made-up word, and yet people were able to generate the plural, right? So they had some knowledge about these sublexical systematicities they're able to make use of and apply to novel forms. And of course, we can do this all the time. We can figure out what a Twitterer is, and whether something is Googleable and things like this, right? I mean, we have to be able to take existing pieces and combine them in new ways. However, there's been a very, very long-standing and continuing debate about what we really know when we know this kind of stuff, right? So what's the real status of the knowledge that dogs equals more than one dog, or wugs equals more than one wug, or that walked equals walk in the past, whatever that exactly means, or a teacher, one who teaches, right? So what's the real status of the relationship between this sort of structural analysis? There's two pieces in some sense, and each of them is contributing systematically to the meaning. What's the nature of the relationship between those kind of systematicities and the knowledge that teacher means teacher, we can use it in that way. So critically, do we really actually online, in real time, compose dogs out of two pieces every single time we generate it, or every single time we understand it? Right now, are you analyzing that as dogs and doing some work? Or does learning these kind of morphological generations amount to building up very strong, memorized correspondences? Right? And this gets into big debates about the nature of storage and questions that go way beyond morphology, of course. And also there's questions about the extent to which, if we do some composition on the fly, maybe we have to do composition for Googleable, is it the case that we do this across the board for all morphologically complex, even the really, really familiar ones like dogs and teachers? And if we do it for all morphologically complex words, even if the answer to both of the first two questions is yes, when do we do this? That is it a really early, critical, necessary first step? Or is it like, well, once you recognize the word, then you do some analysis on it, but it's sort of a secondary level of processing. And this is a tiny sampling of the various ways in which people have, some of the big names of people who've been arguing about this for many, many years now. So I think, this is me getting to have a strong opinion here, I think the debates are 99% resolved, many of them, by a body of research that begins in 1999 with some studies at Cambridge University and then really picks off in 2002, 2003, that all have roughly this structure and flavor. They involve comparing genuine, uncontroversial morphological complexity of the hunter-hunt kind, that is, a hunter is someone who hunts, there's a transparent formal and a transparent semantic relationship, with what's alternately called either pseudo-complexity or opaque complexity. These are, you get into the debate about which is the appropriate way to describe these things, with something like brother broth. So there is formal overlap with exactly the same kind as a teacher teach, but there is no semantic relationship between the most normal meaning for brother, certainly in my pronunciation, brother, and broth. So it's an accidental overlap that could potentially be morphologically complex. That is, one could construct the English word brother, who is someone who broths, and brothing involves, making soup, right? So we can build these things. There is a possible analysis, but it's certainly not the normal analysis of brother. And there's a chunk of these that have this kind of property. Number is another one, and so on. And then these are compared with things like brothel broth, where there's stem overlap of the same kind, but the O is not an actual existing morpheme in English, so there's no complete parsability. That is, this thing doesn't segment into two pieces that could plausibly be analyzed as morphological constituents. And the mask priming paradigm, in case anyone hasn't encountered it before, involves two critical ingredients. One is presenting the prime for a very, very short period of time, well below the level of perceptibility, well below the level that most people would notice. And then also a mask, a visual mask, in this case just hash marks. Sometimes people use a random string of letters or symbols and so on to really sort of to mask in both directions. So this is forward masked by the number signs, and it's backward masked by the presentation of the target immediately in that visual space. So you're working with 40 milliseconds worth of visual information of the prime. So critically, the idea is with a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of information, we can try to get at really early form level information that you're able to extract and distinguish that from much later global, higher level information. And what's been found with this paradigm is that there is systematic priming. This should be in the next slide. Teacher primes teach. So 40 milliseconds of exposure to teacher makes you faster to decide that teach is the real word of English. 40 milliseconds of exposure to brother makes you faster to decide that broth is a real word of English, despite them having no real relationship at all. But 40 milliseconds of exposure to brothel doesn't facilitate or prime broth in any way. And there are now more than 20 studies reporting these kinds of results across a pretty broad range of languages, not nearly as comprehensive a set as you'd like, but getting there. And this is a really robust, reliable effect. So what we know then from these mask priming studies is that there, as I say, consensus-ish, there's this early stage of orthographic processing, which involves detecting potential morphological constituents purely on the basis of their word form characteristics. Right? There's no effective semantics because you get the priming for brother to broth, and there's no semantic relationship there. And this mechanism, at some level of description, operates equally over genuine complexity like teacher, and pseudo-complexity like corner. So this is a figure borrowed from Marcus Taft. It's a very kind of very simple model of what the idea here is that there's a level of form code encoding in which there's a segmentation, or I think he calls it an affix stripping process, and that subsequent processing is fed by that stage. That is, at the lemma level, what you're activating are stems, and then there's some separate system that may be responsible for coping with affixal information. You're never activating seeming or seems as a stored lexical item, right? That's the strong version of this story. And this is all behavioral research using this masked finding paradigm where you try to be really clever with your design and only allow people a tiny amount of information, and then from that assume, okay, given that we gave them only a tiny amount of information and they were able to do what they were able to do, we can make conclusions about stages of processing and so on. But it would be nice to actually look at that processing, not just infer that it probably exists. And so the line of research that I and my collaborators have been pursuing is to look for a neural correlate, a potential neural correlate of this early stage of orthographic processing. So the first obvious candidate for this is something I'm sure everyone has encountered in some level of description or another. And by the way, please stop me at any point if you have questions. I know I tend to go talk quickly, but I'm happy to stop and clarify anything that's not clear. So this visual word form area has been famously identified, gosh, I guess, a while ago now. We've known that there was this region for a very long time, but these studies by the Dahan lab have sort of systematically shown that it's got a set of properties that are particularly interesting, potentially for sort of the thing that, for sort of linguistic level processing. So it's a region, and it's also a response in time. And we're going to be focusing much more on the timing of it. That is, it's using space to constrain our zeroing in on the response and then looking at the timing of the response. But critically, this particular response that originates in the left fusiform gyrus area is insensitive to variations in these kind of surface features. So you can change case without modulating it. It's insensitive to hemisphere of presentation. It's insensitive also to these kind of semantic level distinctions, so level distinctions, say between high and low frequency. But it's sensitive to orthographic regularities. So it's sensitive to the orthographic plausibility of a string and things like that. So it's the way that Cohen and McCandless and Dahan and so on talk about it, it's the first point in time where there is this systematic sensitivity to some degree of language-specific processing and some degree of abstraction away from really low-level form sensitivity.
Can you just give an example maybe of the sort of stimuli that would trigger that?
So the letter string. So you compare letter strings to a symbol string, for instance. But this particular study, this figure here, is comparing hemisphere presentation of letter strings. So if you take so if you present either to the right or the left visual field, it doesn't matter. So here you get sensitivity, right? So you in this earlier response in the primary visual areas.
So sensitive to orthographic regularities, you would pick
so
that
for
up
instance,
symbols versus
or a consonant string versus a pronounceable word of English, for instance. So that level of orthographic regularity. So a consonant string that begins MZ in English would, you get differential sensitivity to the word likeness of it in a particular language. And there's been research on this now done with both kana and kanji in Japanese, and there is a little bit of research. I think there's one study looking at either Arabic or Hebrew, I don't remember now which it is. And there is, the bulk of the research is with alphabetic systems. So I mean, there's, with almost everything I'm going to talk about, and we're just having this conversation, there's a massive amount of low-hanging fruit. There are massive numbers of studies that haven't been done yet. So although 2000 already starts to feel like ancient history in some sense, it's incredibly recent in terms of the time course of what's been done and what needs doing here. So this is a plausible candidate. It's probably the earliest we could look for some sort of response that might have the properties of this sort of sensitivity. So this is the working hypothesis that was behind the kind of big line of research that I'll discuss, is that it's this VWF stage, this visual word form processing stage, at which you finally are decoding things at the level, and I mean, as vision people, feel free to like sneer at this if this is somehow inappropriate, if this is a massive oversimplification. I don't intend any insults because what I'm really critically interested in is sort of the end state of this process. The idea that at some point we get to this kind of fairly abstract representation of the signal, abstracting away from, as I say, case and the color of the font and the size of the font and all the hemisphere presentation, the low-level cues about edge detect, the edges and so on, where all of that primary visual processing has happened and there's some kind of coherent representation. So that's the earliest we could plausibly look for any kind of analysis into segments of this kind. And the tool that's been used for this, I shouldn't say that we have used because a lot of the research I'll quickly cover is people other than me have done, is AnyG. So the great thing about AnyG is that it allows you to model evoked activity in a way that EEG doesn't. It's got much better spatial resolution for a variety of reasons I can talk about later if you're interested. So it allows you to do something like what we want to do, which is say not just is there a response in some time window that's sensitive to a manipulation, but is that response originating in the little chunk of cortex we think cares about these kinds of features. So we can actually restrict our analysis just to the fusiform gyrus. Now we're still dealing with centimeters of cortex, not the millimeters that fMRI lets you deal with, but we have the millisecond time resolution to add, so it's a fairly powerful tool for the kinds of things that we want to do. So what we're interested in is this left fusiform gyrus activity that you can kind of see. This is an inflated brain in case people haven't seen these things before, so you're looking at both the gyri and the sulci sort of pushed out to the edge so you can kind of see everything. And we're interested in this kind of activation here that is coming from the sites that have been identified with fMRI as the neural source of the visual word form response and are associated with, as you can see, significant activation in this 1 to 200 millisecond time window. And the answer so far to this question, that is this visual word form response the thing we're looking for, the sensitive measure that detects something about morphological structure, the answer so far looks pretty good. So this is the earliest study of this kind. Now we're getting into really recent history here, where Zweigepinken systematically, so they did two experiments, one looking at suffixes and the other prefixes, comparing genuinely complex teacher, again, with something like straight, which is there is absolutely no parse of it that will get you morphemes. Then things like winter. So winter is different from brother in that wint is not a stem. So the only thing winter has going for it that's interesting is it's got this ER piece. And that was, so in this study they're just interested in presence absence of some sort of affixal information, whether that would drive the effect. And what they find is that there's a systematic increase in activity around 170 milliseconds. You can't see from this very clearly, but originating in the left, and here they also plot the right fusiform areas. So this is the way they generated this this waveform is by taking the Taylor coordinates of the visual word form response, seeding them, and saying, look, what activity in the brain is plausibly originating at these specific coordinates. So that's what's being plotted here. And this is the increase in activation just in the case of teacher, or refill, just in the case of genuine morphological complexity. So there's sensitivity to, this thing has 2 morphemes, these other things don't. And there's no difference between straight and winter. So just having the ER isn't triggering the effect. It has to be genuine, completely parsable into segments. At least,
I'm not used to looking at AnyG outputs. Would that constitute a big effect what we're looking at, or is it?
It's significant, yeah. Sorry, they didn't plot error bars on it here. I can refer you to the paper for the. But yeah, so the effect is, it's about, whatever it is, 10 femtoteslas, which of course is vanishingly tiny in the physical universe, but it's a reliable and significant difference. And this is ground average data.
It's not about significance, it's
Yeah.
about like effect sizes. It's
Yeah.
sort of like comparable, like to what people find.
Yeah, so these are completely comparable. The other big body of research that looks at this area is face recognition research.
Yeah.
So the fusiform face area in the right hemisphere is supposed to have a lot of these sensitivities, and is probably the evolutionary, path that gets us to the reading sensitivity that we have, and it's exactly the same magnitude of effects that you see in AnyG research showing sensitivity to faces versus houses, for instance. So tiny effects, but robust and well within the range of what's normal for these kinds of response components. Subsequent to this study, the Zweig-Tokinen study, Alan Morantz and his lab at NYU, with whom I'm collaborating on the data that I'll present today, has developed a technique to do single word reading and to do correlational analyses of AnyG data. This is kind of a big deal because it's not really possible to do any kind of correlational analyses of, well, it's not impossible to do correlational analyses of EEG data, it's just not done at all. You'll never, hardly ever see EEG data presented as the effect, of the signal increases or decreases as a function of some systematic variation in my data. It's always a binned analysis, these guys versus these guys. And there's many good reasons for that. But again, with AnyG, because we can really combine the power of space and time, we just get a much better signal-to-noise ratio that lets us do this kind of research. And so what Morantz and colleagues have been looking at then is building on this early Zweig-Tokinen finding that it does look like this response cares about morphological structure, is to then look at what exactly about morphological structure is being used, right? So now what's the nature of the information that you're using? Because these things don't come with little labels on them, right? Teacher doesn't come along saying, hi, I'm 2 pieces, pick me up and so on, right? So there has to be some mechanism for detecting the potential of there being 2 pieces and distinguishing between teacher and winter, for instance, right? Where one has a genuine stem and the other not. And so what Morantz and colleagues have been investigating are 2 variables, or what they found are the 2 variables that show strong sensitivity in this response. First is morphological transition probability. That is to say, the relationship between the surface frequency of the whole form and the lemma frequency of the stem. So where this is, where the surface frequency of taxable is relatively low, but the lemma frequency of tax is actually quite high, you get quite different relationships than these unique stem words like vulnerable, where the lemma frequency of vulner is exactly the same as the surface frequency of vulnerable. It's the only instance of where this thing ever occurs in the language, is in this context. And it looks like, it's a good candidate kind of information to use, is just how likely is this whole thing given this stem. That looks, it's a piece of information that's, plausibly available, and it looks like something that the system cares about. So the transition probability is this darker line here, and this is plotting the strength of the correlation between transition probability and the evoked magnetic signal. And you can see in this critical time window, this black line up here between 170 and 210 milliseconds, you get a significant correlation. Yeah.
Let me just try to see if I get this
Yes.
right. So taxable because tax by itself appears so often more
Yes.
than taxable.
Yeah,
Versus vulnerable, where every time you got vulnerable.
yeah,
That's what correlates in a different way to the brain pattern in that fusiform jargon.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea is that you're using this information to essentially decide whether to segment.
Yep.
It's a really useless idea to segment vulnerable, even though the other parts there, you're not gaining anything because you can store this whole. But you're gaining a lot if you segment here because your tax shows up all over the place, and then you have access to everything you know about tax and so on, and you can make use of the constituent information. So that was the thought. This would be a useful piece of information, and it does indeed look like the system is sensitive. The darker, this black line here is the surface frequency of the whole piece, and you can see a tiny correlation, but it's much smaller and shorter duration. And the, what is the BF? Now I can't remember what the other frequency is. Anyways, it's irrelevant. Clearly not correlating. Sorry, this is not my data system because I don't remember all the details. The other variable that they were interested in is also the frequency of the affix itself. And so they took a whole bunch of words that had a whole range of different affixes and found that highly frequent affixes like eon, or words with highly frequent affixes on them like traction or something like that, the frequency of the affix alone was driving the response. So even a word like traction, which itself is fairly low frequency, would be associated with more activation than a word that had the same whole word frequency but has a lower frequency affix in it. So where again you just see sensitivity to these properties of the pieces of the word and the sort of the reliability, the usefulness of extracting them in some sense. And then in this 2011 study, they looked at these kinds of items, these pseudo-affixed items that I've mentioned before. So things like adder and corner and brother, none of which are morphologically complex, right? It is possible that an adder could be someone who adds, but it's certainly not its most common use. And a corner, someone who corns, a brother, someone who broths, whatever those would mean. But again, those are not the common meanings of these words. And again, transition probability. So add itself is reasonably high frequency. So it's not the worst idea in the world to try a compositional analysis of adder. That is, occasionally you're actually going to be right. And impressionistically, I think we all agree, adder as someone who adds seems somehow more accessible and reasonable than brother as someone who broths, whatever broth would mean, right? Whereas again, brother, like is close to vulnerable at that end of the spectrum. I mean, broth does have a lemma frequency of its own, but it's tiny, tiny, tiny compared to the frequency of brother. So it's a kind of it's a lousy analysis to pursue, and the system seems to be less excited about pursuing. You get less of this correlation with activation. Okay, so that brings us now, oh goody, halfway through, about where we should be, to the question that I'm trying to answer with the data that I want to discuss today, which is what about things like sold or bought or sang? Right, so we've just been discussing all of these string cases where the string itself is easily segmentable, but what do we do when we have cases where that's not obviously the case? So there's a de in sold, there's no sell in sold in the string, right? There's certainly no buy, either orthographically or phonologically in bought in the form level, right? So there's no meaningful sense in which one could calculate a transition probability. What would that even be? Sang is even hard. There's nothing added. So as a minor caveat on this, just so we don't give up completely, we know that we can handle some level of blurring or some level of messiness, right? So things like lived, where who knows where the e belongs, or reliant, where the y somehow becomes an I in this context, or movable, where we just don't the e just disappears for some reason. Orthographically, there's a consistent body of research that shows we're pretty good at, this doesn't completely destroy our ability to understand these words, or even to process them as morphologically complex. But so we have some level of ability to cope with imperfect segmentability. And the question is how far that extends, how robust that is, what other mechanisms might be available. And one of the most popular answers in the literature has been more or less to give up on this. I mean, this is my take on the Pinker approach to this, is just to say, there's really nothing going on. To deal with sold or bought or sang, you just memorize it. There's no, he wasn't thinking in terms of transition probabilities, but there's no systematicity, there's no affix, so we give up. There's no morphology. You can describe relationships, but you're just memorizing the relationship between hold and held. There's no generation, there's no any morphological complexity of any kind. Yeah.
So as you're presenting it, I realize also that I've read close to nothing when looking at these stuff, because my first question is, did anybody ever look at whether or not you're slower or faster to process them than the regular one?
Yeah, so there's been a huge literature trying to show that, for instance, stem frequency drives processing of regulars, whereas the whole word frequency drives the processing of the irregulars, and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's been a 30-year debate as to whether this is the right model and whether you can systematically distinguish regulars from irregulars. And of course, you can find all kinds of ways in which they're different. They're different. I'm not pretending they're not different.
So if you were going to construct your artificial super language, you want to go for the regular ones?
How do you mean?
If you want to make a language that is the most efficient one, like what linguists did with Korean at a certain point, right, where they had like free reign, and would you go for regulars or would you go for the irregulars? Irregulars, you would have to memorize them.
Irregulars are irregulars. I mean, irregulars are noise in the system, right? And so we'll see. I think one of the big interesting questions is how much of this, like how do we handle exceptionality? Very generally, right? There's sort of like this designy kind of question. Why is there exceptionality? Why do languages tolerate it? Right? And it's clearly on some level they tolerate it because kids are able to learn it and they're able to replicate it to the next generation. So there's room, there's robustness in linguistic systems generally to tolerating exceptions. Right? Obviously, from a design perspective, you wouldn't put them in there, but they don't seem to disappear. Right? That is. At least the high frequency ones have been with us for a very long time and look well set to stick with us for a very long time and continue. And people, you even see innovations in people turning regulars into irregulars very occasionally and things like that. So it doesn't seem to cause a breakdown in the system.
From a monolingual point of view, or from a bilingual point of view,
so there's no question. And I won't try to undermine the idea that there's something special about irregulars and they have to be learned on a case-by-case basis. But the question is what you learn about them on a case-by-case basis. Whether the only thing you learn about them is there's some relationship, some connection between hold and held, or whether the analysis can go deeper than that, right? So let's put it that way. Can the analysis go deeper? And the answer is yes, and it has been since Chomsky and Halley 1965. There's been proposals on the table for ways of generating. You'll notice the direction of the arrows here, right? This is a model which takes, a fragment of a sentence and, a verb in a context, in the context of pastness, and then in that context figures out how to pronounce it, and then does some form change to change the pronunciation of the stem itself. There are a bunch of layers, a bunch of levels. Linguists love lots and lots of stages of processing. And you ultimately end up with a form. And, you might balk at the number of different levels, but it's really straightforward to make a model that does this from a production point of view. That is, if you know what you're starting with, and you're starting with past and a root, it's pretty easy to generate. You have to look some things up on some lists, but that may be the case anyways, and there's all kinds of idiosyncratic knowledge that we need to know about things. It's a lot less obvious that this is how you unpack this, right? So if something like this is true, that is, there really is a cell somewhere buried deep in sold, how you get there is less obvious. So that's really what I'm interested in, is just, is it plausible? Is there any evidence at all that we do attempt to pull this into pieces and detect the morphological structure that's there. And so just to be clear, the predictions of this kind of model, that sang is really a root sing and a past tense morpheme, just like walked is really two pieces, then activating or processing sang necessarily involves activating the root sing, and so you should get priming effects. But moreover, this story says that the de in sold and the te in kept are the same de that you get in walked. Right? They're really actually exponents of it. And so there should be some kind of morpho-orthographic segmentation even for these cases. And finally, this is the kind of fun version of it, but also the hardest piece of this is that you actually should see more orthographic segmentation effects for pseudo-irregulars, like Bellball, exactly equivalent to the brother-Roth effect. Right? If we're really doing this purely on the basis of form and on the basis of patterns, and if I'm claiming there's a pattern that relates sell and sold, then there had better be some way of, you better at least try the possibility, entertain the possibility that there's a relationship between bell and bold, and then discard it in the same way that we have to discard the Roth-er analysis of brother. So the first question is what my PhD dissertation was largely attempting to address using overt priming as rather than masked priming. And I was, again, using AnyG, comparing irregulars, regulars, and these accidental cases of form and semantic overlap in the absence of morphology. So things like boil and broil, or crinkle and wrinkle, or ghost and ghoul, and so on. And this is just the magnitude of the priming effect. So that is the difference between the primed and unprimed conditions for give, gave, teach, taught, date, dated, and then boil, broil. So AnyG are the black bars, and the reaction time measures are the gray bars, and it's, some very little interesting differences in the reaction time, but generally speaking, big robust priming for both the regulars and the irregulars in the brain response. So at least suggesting that there is activation of these stems. That is, when you're processing gave, you're getting facilitation of give. And that can't be just due to some kind of form and meaning overlap, because when you're processing broil, you're not getting any facilitation of boil. That is, this is an accidental form meaning overlap rather than systematic form meaning overlap, and there seems to be a meaningful difference between those. But the cooler, the more exciting, and the thing that kind of kicked us back into doing this research is a study by David Capaldi and colleagues from 2010, trying to investigate the third promise, the C promise that I made, which is to actually look at this bell-fall versus bell-ball contrast. So they were comparing genuine irregulars using mask priming now, so 40 milliseconds of exposure to bell, does it prime fall? 40 milliseconds of exposure to bell, does it prime ball? And they find significant priming from bell-fall as compared to the orthographic and unrelated conditions, but they don't find it for bell-fall. So on the one hand, how exciting, right? So here's pretty convincing evidence that this same technique that we were using to look at regular affixal morphology is also getting you significant priming from fell to fall with just 40 milliseconds of exposure to fell. So you're doing something really rapid, really early in your processing of fell that's allowing you to get priming for fall, but you don't see it with Bellball. So it's not quite as simple as we don't see an easy replication of the brother-Roth effect here. So what we wanted to do is take this behavioral mass primality and do it in AnyG. So this is work that's still in progress. We're looking at both irregular and regular allomorphy and the pseudo-irregular cases, and we're looking for the neural correlate of mass priming, but we're also comparing mass priming with single word reading studies. and we're looking for the effect of these various predictors. So do we get effects of transition probability for the regulars, and do we get some signal or some sensitivity to this overt affix across the board, so that doesn't really distinguish between regulars and irregulars. And then the third variable that we're interested in, trying to figure out what would be a correlate or an analog to the transition probabilities for regulars, is islands of reliability. So, sorry, I'm running out of time here. But this is a model that from Albright and Hayes, which looks at the similarity of any string to other members of a class that's defined, in this case, phonologically. So how similar is scribe to any other members of the class that might involve some kind of I stem, and compare that to the similarity of scribe to Albert. So that is, how good of a member of this alternation class would it be? So something like bleed bled is actually very, very good candidate for this alternation. If we didn't know that bled was the past tense of bleed, the system would still generate it a lot of the time, because there's a whole family of forms that have a very similar form. I mean, these are sub-regularities in essence. They're statistical, they're stochastic, they're never 100%. But there are strong sub-patterns within the irregulars. There's these clusters, and this is just a way of quantifying those. I'll leave it at that. So let's see. I'm actually going to skip the single word reading study. Oops, I'll go back one, which is just to identify, to remind me the regions of interest that we're looking at in these studies, this 100 and 200 milliseconds. So these early visual responses, and using this tool, I can come back to that later. I'm worried about time, so I'm going to skip the single word reading study, even though it's cute, and just look at the mass priming study, since that's what we've spent the most time on. So we were then comparing regular, irregular, pseudo-irregular, and then an identity condition as a kind of baseline. So trial, 33 milliseconds of exposure to the prime, so very short, and 12 participants, so not a huge amount. But nonetheless, and this is something that we see over and over again with AnyG studies, is that even though you have a small number of participants, something about putting people in a scanner makes them take life so much more seriously that you can actually get robust behavioral effects with a much smaller sample size than you would in a button press kind of lab. And so these are the subtractions from the related and unrelated priming conditions, and the estimated p-values. So what you see here, we get robust identity priming, no surprise, robust regular priming, no surprise. We replicate the Crepaldi et al. Effect with our irregulars, that is, we get robust priming. And we almost get there with these pseudo-irregulars. So this is a behavioral measure, we almost get significant, I know almost is nothing, but if you look at the effect size, right, it's actually the same size of priming that you get from Bellball as Bellball.
So if it's the same size, could it be that some participants have it and some don't?
Or some items, I think. Yeah. So this is one of the things we're exploring, is whether the pure stem change items and the items that actually have the affix, that's probably a distinction that's important to make. Then we look at the priming effects. So this is just across all items, related versus unrelated trials in this time region that we're interested in. The source is plotted up there in the green, so in the left fusiform gyrus, and the gray shading is where there's a significant mean effect of priming in this region. So we get sensitivity to the priming manipulation where we were looking for it. Now, the irregulars, nice, big, huge, robust, as far as these things go, priming effect. So we not only replicated the Crepaldi et al. Behavioral effect, we found what we were looking for in the brain, that is brain sensitivity in this chunk of cortex that we think cares about these features at the point in time that we think that we should see the effects of between 154 and 183 milliseconds, and significant difference between related and unrelated conditions. The Albright score, right, which is our attempt at quantifying how robust and how reliable these subregularities are. Also gives us a significant, so in the irregulars here, I know this is a fairly messy graph, but it's the irregulars are significantly, there's a significant correlation for the irregulars between all byte score and prime type. That is, so where you have an irregular prime, you get a significant increase in activation in this region as a function of all byte score. That is tracking how reliable or robust. That is, the more robust the pattern is, the more activation you have in this region. Analogous to this kind of transition probability. That is how likely or how strong is the morphological analysis, or plausible is the morphological analysis, maybe. With the regulars, we get this really weird late effect, which I don't have anything to say about, so I won't. And however, now when we look at the irregulars versus the pseudo-irregulars, only the irregulars. So irregular related versus irregular unrelated, big effect that I just showed you, but with the pseudo-related and unrelated, it's no clear pattern, tiny little differences, but nothing you could interpret. So we failed to find the neural correlate of our almost behavioral effect. Possibly not surprising. Okay, so I mean, I'll wrap up now. So this is all right. I'm only 5 minutes over.
Oh, you can take the time.
Yeah. At the earliest stages, we can detect with the tools that we have. We seem to be using relatively abstract knowledge about the formal units that our language is built on to guide parsing. Right? So these are morphological constituents, not orthographically defined constituents, and so on. And this seems to be true even when the morphological structure of a word is hidden. That we're really reliably unpacking it and mapping from the whole form to constituent pieces. Now, this shouldn't be as surprising as maybe it might be. I mean, I've given you a story about English and these weird irregulars in English, and English irregulars are weird, and they're a tiny little corner of the language. But this kind of ability, this ability to extract structure even when it's not concatenative, is obviously required for all of the languages of the world and all of the forms of morphology in the world that don't involve a stem and an affix and a clear edge between them. So this is, a roundabout way, in essence, of getting at bigger questions, because this is now the first time we're starting to get some idea of what kinds of information you might use to do this, this detection and unpacking. And what we hope is this really opens the door to research on processing a much broader range of morphologically interesting phenomena. Because the more time you spend on it, the more you realize the English irregular past tense is not interesting. It's become this huge area of debate and discussion for strange historical reasons. What's really interesting are reduplication in Tagalog, or sort of truncation effects in Brazilian Portuguese, or ablaut in German, or binyanim in Hebrew. All of these these incredibly cool morphological phenomena that involve non-affixal, non-segmental morphology. So we have plans. We're working on finding other ways of getting at something like the Bellball effect. So we're trying to play around with looking at non-words to see whether we can still get some kind of activation of the relationship, that is this this pattern. We're trying to find evidence for there being this systematic pattern of the E type independent of any lexical factors. And then in the NYU lab, in part in collaboration with the NYU Abu Dhabi Center that's recently been set up, there's a move towards trying to start looking at actual non-concatenative morphology. So I know there's one study on Arabic that's happening right now, but it's really early days, and again, massive amounts of low-hanging fruit. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, I don't know how many talks you've given about Arabic, but Arabic is a brilliantly exciting language to look at for morphological reasons, because it does morphology in much more interesting ways than English does. So it involves the root information that is in something like, kick in English or cut is only sort of in the consonants of a word. The vowels tell you, for instance, whether it's active or passive, right? And the skeletal structure, that is how many instances of b and how many instances of t you get, tells you whether it's perfective or imperfective, right? So you have different kinds of information are carried in different parts of the sort of the skeleton and the shape of the word. So here's the excellent candidate for regular, regular but not non-affixal morphology, where the question is, can you pull these things apart? So what I'm just quickly showing here are studies from Sami Budalai and William Marsland Wilson that use mask priming to look at whether you get this sort of effect in Arabic. So behavioral mask priming, and they get priming for the whole word pattern and for the skeleton, but they don't find any effect for the vowel. So there's, but this is basically one study, and there are many issues. Brown Frost, I think, has been doing a few things related to this in Hebrew as well, but lots and lots of research to be done there. And I will stop now. Thank you. And hopefully take questions.
Any questions? I've got a question.
Okay, excellent.
Could you go back on the slides?
Yeah.
I'll say something. You're almost there.
So, sorry, this was the ones that I skipped. We could go back to that now, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we're looking at mask priming and lexical decision.
Yeah.
And you as a prime have fell for fall and bell for ball.
Yeah.
Okay. I know this is a very difficult question, and then you might go like, yeah, I know. But what's semantics and what's morphology? I mean, if fell and fall, it's really close semantically, so you'll have associative priming there. Whereas bell and ball, the distance is of course further.
Yes. So right. So the question, this is in the context of a huge amount of literature showing you basically don't get semantic priming with this mask priming paradigm, is one of the answers to that, right? And this study didn't actually have a semantic condition, but the best version of the study would then include a semantic condition and show you nonetheless this is distinct from that. That is, you just want, it's not actually that hard of a question in principle. They didn't have one in this study.
They didn't have one in this study.
And there's a huge, it's the basis, so I think somewhere in here I have reference to.
So it's within that specific one, because associative priming is actually quite robust, of course.
It is, but the consent, okay, so here's where this, Russell and Davis, out of these 20 or so studies that Russell and Davis summarize, 17 of them show equivalent priming for teacher, teach, and brother, broth. 3 of them show greater priming from teacher to teach than from brother to broth. And people have argued that that's to do with the fact that there's actually also the semantic relationship in one case and not in the other. And that's up for debate still. There's some, it's at the very edges of the effect. There's some possibility that some people, some of the time, seem to get some evidence for activation of semantic features with only 40 milliseconds of exposure to the prime.
So if you were to find something in your reaction data but not in your fully formed jars, you would probably go semantics then.
No, then it depends what the other options are. So one of the things that I skipped over is, of course, the fusiform gyrus is not the only bit of brain that does visual processing. And so in the single word reading study that I skipped just for simplicity, we have actual cuneus activation. So the distinction between the sensitivity to the presence or absence of this to, for instance, actually shows up in cuneus, and it shows up at 100 milliseconds on 150, so it's actually an earlier response. And there's a small but growing body of research now that's looking at morphologically complex words in sentential context and showing actually you get tons of effects in this cuneus region that's even earlier and even lower level in some sense, if you've got prediction about form and you're evaluating match between what you're predicting and what you've actually got. So there's the question about semantics is partially, I mean, this is kind of partly where the transition probability research potentially is really useful, is in teasing apart semantic relatedness versus the basically entropy, that is predictability of the whole word given the stem. And although it doesn't rule out the possibility that you might be doing some semantic analysis, Alec has done some work and some modeling work taking up some of these earlier studies and shown that you can use transition probability accounts for 100% of what people have said is a semantic effect. That is just this entropy measure, which is purely form-based. So I mean, part of this is, what's the word for it? Your inclination. But I mean, for me, it's really interesting to push the idea that this is low-level word form-based to its maximum, and then that semantic processing, activation of knowledge of the meaning and conceptual information is parasitic on that. But it gets into these serial parallel debates, right? So when do you, how encapsulated is any of this?